She arrived at the audition hall early in the morning carrying nothing but a worn handbag and a quiet sense of purpose. Her name was Clara, and she lived a life that most people never noticed. She worked long hours at a small grocery store, folding boxes, restocking shelves, and helping customers who rarely remembered her face. She dressed simply because it was practical, not because she lacked care. She never imagined her appearance would matter more than her music, but that day would teach her how quickly people judge without listening. The audition hall was inside an old cultural center with tall windows, wooden floors, and rows of metal chairs. The piano sat at the front, polished and black, reflecting the overhead lights. Clara paused at the doorway, taking a deep breath. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from memory. Each step forward brought back years of quiet practice alone in her small apartment. After long shifts, her neighbors sometimes complained, but she kept playing softly, determined not to lose the one thing that made her feel alive. Other contestants were already there. Some wore elegant dresses, others carried leather cases and spoke confidently about conservatories, competitions, and famous teachers. Their laughter filled the room, and their eyes wandered toward Clara more than once. She felt their glances slide over her clothes, her shoes, her tired face. She sat alone in a corner and placed her handbag at her feet, then folded her hands in her lap. She did not try to blend in or stand out. She simply waited. Judges entered shortly after. 3 people, 2 men and 1 woman, all well-dressed with confident posture. They spoke briefly among themselves and began calling names one by one. Contestants approached the piano and played. Some performances were impressive, others forgettable. The judges nodded, whispered, and wrote notes. The atmosphere grew heavier as time passed. Clara listened carefully, not comparing herself, but absorbing the room, the sound, the energy, the pressure. She had waited years for this moment, and she was about to waste it on doubts. As her turn drew closer, the murmurs around her grew louder. She overheard a young man whisper to another contestant, asking why someone like her had even applied. A woman nearby smiled politely, but her eyes carried amusement. Clara pretended not to notice. She focused on her breathing and on the memory of her mother sitting beside her at an old upright piano when she was a child, guiding her fingers patiently. Her mother had believed in her even when no one else did, and that belief carried. Moments like this. When her name was finally called, there was a brief pause followed by a few stifled laughs. Clara stood slowly and walked toward the piano. Her posture was calm, though her heart beat strongly. She felt every eye in the room on her, some curious, some dismissive, some already bored. She sat on the bench, adjusted it slightly, and placed her hands above the keys. For a moment, she closed her eyes, not to delay, but to remember why she was there. The judge in the center cleared his throat and asked what she would be playing. Clara answered softly, giving the title of a classical piece known for its emotional depth. The judge raised an eyebrow as if surprised, but said nothing. The room settled into silence, broken only by the faint hum of the lights. Clara lifted her hands and began. At first her touch was gentle, almost hesitant, not because she lacked skill, but because she was feeling the room, testing its response. Each note was placed with care, like a quiet conversation. She was not performing for applause, she was telling a story. As the melody unfolded, her confidence grew. Her fingers moved with precision, shaped by years of discipline and solitude. The sound filled the hall, warm and resonant. Some listeners shifted in their seats, others leaned forward without realizing it. The laughter had stopped, the whispers faded. The judges looked up from their notes, drawn in by the sincerity of her playing. Clara remained focused, lost in the music, yet fully present. She poured her experiences into the keys, the exhaustion, the loneliness, the hope, the love she had carried silently for so long. Her music did not shout, it spoke, it rose and fell like breath, carrying emotion without exaggeration. There was strength in its restraint and honesty in its tone. The piano responded to her touch as if it had been waiting for her. The hall seemed smaller, more intimate, as if the music had wrapped itself around every person there. As she played, Clara felt a shift within herself. The nerves disappeared, replaced by clarity. She was no longer the woman they mocked. She was simply a musician doing what she was meant to do. Each passage flowed into the next. Without hesitation, her hands moved effortlessly, guided by muscle memory and heart. The piece built toward a quiet intensity that held the room completely still. When the final notes faded, she let her hands rest on the keys for a brief moment, then lowered them to her lap. She opened her eyes. The silence that followed was not awkward or dismissive. It was full, heavy, and sincere. No one moved, no one spoke. The judges stared at her, not with judgment, but with surprise and something deeper, recognition. Clara stood slowly and stepped away from the piano. She did not bow or seek approval. She simply returned to her seat. Her heart was steady now. Whatever happened next, she knew she had played honestly, and that was enough. For the first time that morning, she allowed herself a small breath of relief, unaware that this moment was only the beginning of a story that would change how everyone in that room saw her. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. The silence, after Clara finished playing, lingered longer than anyone expected. It was not the kind of silence that felt empty or uncomfortable. It was heavy with feeling, as if the music was still moving through the room. Even the air seemed different. People who moments earlier had been restless now sat completely still, unsure how to respond. The judges looked at one another briefly, as if trying to understand what they had just witnessed. The woman judge was the first to lower her pen. She leaned back slightly, her expression no longer professional and distant, but thoughtful and unsettled. The man in the center adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat again, though this time the sound carried uncertainty. Rather than authority, he glanced at Clara, who sat quietly with her hands folded, and her eyes lowered. She did not seek eye contact or approval. She seemed calm, almost removed from the tension she had created. Whispers began to spread slowly, and cautiously. No one laughed now. The earlier smirks had vanished, replaced by surprise and confusion. Some contestants shifted in their chairs, suddenly aware of how quickly they had judged her. A young woman in an elegant dress stared at Clara with wide eyes, replaying the performance in her mind. Another contestant shook his head softly, as if trying to wake himself from a dream. The judge in the center finally spoke and thanked Clara for her performance. His voice sounded restrained, as if he were choosing his words carefully. He asked a simple question about her background, where she studied, who her teachers were. Clara stood again and answered honestly. She explained that she had never attended a formal conservatory. She had learned from her mother when she was young, and continued on her own through books, recordings, and endless practice. After work, her voice was steady and humble, without apology. That answer caused another shift in the room. The judges exchanged glances again. This time, there was disbelief mixed with curiosity. The idea that such control and emotional depth could come from someone without formal training challenged everything they expected. The woman judge asked how long she had been playing. Clara replied that she started as a child, stopped for several years after her mother passed away, and returned to music later as a way to survive loneliness and grief. As Clara spoke, the room softened. Her story stripped away the remaining distance between her and the audience. She was no longer just a performer, but a person with history, pain, and quiet resilience. People listened closely now, drawn not only to her music, but to her life. The judges nodded, slowly absorbing her words without interruption. When Clara finished answering the questions, she returned to her seat again. She felt exposed, but not ashamed. Sharing her story felt like an extension of her performance, honest and unguarded. Around her, the energy had completely changed. The earlier competitiveness had faded, replaced by reflection. Some contestants looked down at their hands, others stared at the piano, as if seeing it differently for the first time. The audition continued, but the atmosphere never fully returned to what it had been. Each performance that followed was measured against the memory of Clara's playing, not in technical terms, but in emotional truth. The judges listened more carefully now, as if reminded of why music mattered beyond precision and credentials. They asked deeper questions, and seemed less impressed by rehearsed confidence. During a short break, Clara stepped outside the hall into the cool air. She leaned against the stone wall and closed her eyes, letting the tension finally leave her body. Her hands still tingled slightly from the keys. She did not know what the judges would decide, but she felt a quiet satisfaction. She had honored her music and her mother, and that felt like enough. A few moments later, the woman judge stepped outside as well. She hesitated before approaching Clara, unsure how to bridge the distance. She introduced herself not as a judge, but as a fellow musician. She told Clara that her performance had reminded her of why she began playing years ago, before competitions and expectations took over. Her voice was sincere and slightly emotional. Clara listened, politely surprised but grateful. The judge asked Clara if she had ever considered formal training or performing professionally. Clara answered that she never thought it was possible. She explained that life required her to be practical, that music was something she carried privately. The judge smiled gently and told her that talent like hers deserved space and opportunity. She encouraged Clara not to disappear again, regardless of the audition outcome. Inside the hall, the break ended, and contestants were called back. The final names were announced, and the auditions concluded. People gathered their belongings, and conversations filled the room. Clara packed her handbag, slowly feeling detached from the nervous excitement around her. She overheard someone mention her performance with admiration. Another person wondered aloud how they could have misjudged her so badly. When the judges returned to announce that results would be shared later, Clara nodded and prepared to leave. She did not linger or seek reassurance. As she stepped toward the exit, the man who had earlier whispered about her appearance avoided her gaze. He looked uncomfortable and ashamed. Clara noticed, but did not react. She had learned long ago that understanding mattered more than apologies. As she walked home, Clara reflected on the day. She thought of the laughter she heard when she first stood up, and how quickly it vanished. She realized that people often protect their own fears by judging others. Her music had broken through that barrier, not by force, but by honesty. She felt tired, yet lighter than she had in years. That evening, she returned to her small apartment and sat at her old piano. The keys were chipped and uneven, but familiar. She played softly, not for an audience, but for herself. She replayed parts of the audition piece, adjusting phrasing and touch. She smiled quietly, thinking of her mother and the journey that had brought her there. Though she did not know it yet, the audition had already changed her life, not because of acceptance or rejection, but because she had been seen and heard on her own terms. The mockery that once defined the moment no longer held power. It had been replaced by something stronger: recognition and respect born from truth and courage. The days following the audition passed slowly for Clara. Though something inside her had shifted, she returned to her routine at the grocery store, waking early, tying her hair back, wearing the same simple clothes, and greeting customers with quiet politeness. On the surface, nothing had changed, but inside, her thoughts kept returning to the audition hall, the piano, the silence after the final note. She did not replay the mockery, as much as she replayed the stillness that followed it stayed with her like a calm echo. At work, a few customers noticed her distracted expression. One asked if she was feeling unwell. Clara smiled and said she was fine. She did not feel the need to explain. What she carried was not sadness or anxiety, but a sense of awakening that was difficult to describe. She had stepped into a space she once believed was closed to her, and even if it never opened again, she now knew she belonged there. Each evening after her shift, she sat at her piano and practiced with renewed intention. She listened more closely to her own sound, paying attention to subtle changes in touch and emotion. Her playing had always been disciplined, but now it felt freer, as if she had given herself permission to be heard, even when no one was listening. She imagined the concert hall not as a place of judgment, but as a room waiting for honesty. One afternoon, nearly a week after the audition, Clara received a phone call. While she was organizing shelves in the store, the number was unfamiliar. She hesitated, then answered, stepping into a quiet corner. The voice on the other end introduced itself as the assistant to the audition panel and informed her that the judges would like to invite her back for a second round. Clara listened silently, her grip tightening around the phone. She thanked the caller calmly and ended the call before emotion could rise. For a moment, she stood still, surrounded by the faint hum of the store. Then she exhaled slowly and returned to work. Her hands shook slightly, but her expression remained composed. She did not tell anyone, not her coworkers, not her neighbors, not even herself, in words. She carried the news quietly, allowing it to settle without pressure. That evening, she walked home more slowly than usual, noticing details. She often overlooked the sound of distant traffic, the warmth of streetlights, the rhythm of her footsteps. She felt grounded, as if the city itself were listening. She unlocked her apartment and sat at the piano without removing her coat. Her fingers rested on the keys as she considered what she wanted to play next. The second audition was different from the first. This time, she would not be unknown or overlooked. Expectations would follow her, and she understood how heavy those could be. She chose to focus on the music rather than the outcome. She selected a piece that challenged her technically, but more importantly, one that demanded emotional clarity. It required restraint, patience, and vulnerability, qualities she had learned through life rather than lessons. In the days leading up to the second round, she practiced with balance. She rested when her hands grew tired and paused when her thoughts wandered. She revisited old exercises and explored new interpretations. She also took time to reflect on her journey, remembering the years she stopped playing when grief felt unbearable, and the night she returned to the piano alone, guided by instinct rather than ambition. When the day arrived, she dressed simply as before, but with a quiet confidence. She did not attempt to change herself to meet expectations. She understood now that her strength came from authenticity. As she entered the hall, she noticed familiar faces among the judges and contestants. Some nodded politely, others smiled with recognition. There was no laughter this time, only curiosity and respect. She waited calmly as names were called, feeling the same steady presence she had discovered during the first audition. When her turn came, she walked to the piano with ease. The room felt smaller, more focused. She adjusted the bench, placed her hands above the keys, and began. Her playing was different now, not louder or faster, but deeper. She allowed space between phrases, trusting the silence as much as the sound. Her fingers moved with confidence, shaped by intention rather than fear. The music unfolded naturally, each section connected by breath and meaning. She felt fully present, neither performing nor proving, simply expressing. The judges listened intently, taking few notes. Their attention never wavered. The audience remained still, absorbed by the performance. Clara felt the piano respond warmly, as if recognizing her touch. She followed the music to its conclusion and let the final sound fade gently. She remained still for a moment, then stood and stepped back. This time, the silence was followed by quiet murmurs of appreciation. The judges thanked her and asked thoughtful questions about her interpretation and choices. She answered clearly, drawing from her experience and understanding rather than theory. They listened with interest, engaging in conversation rather than evaluation. It felt like a meeting of equals. After the second round, Clara left the hall feeling complete. Regardless of what came next, she knew she had grown. She had faced judgment, uncertainty, and expectation without losing herself. She walked home under a sky streaked with fading light and felt grateful for the path she had taken, even with its detours and delays. Later that week, she received another call. This time, the invitation was not just for advancement, but for opportunity. The judges wanted to connect her with a mentor and offer her access to formal training if she wished. The news arrived gently, without pressure or promises. Clara listened quietly, absorbing the weight of what was being offered. She spent the evening thinking not about prestige or success, but about what music meant to her. She considered the years she believed her chance had passed, and how quietly she had accepted that belief. She realized now that time had not taken anything from her. It had shaped her sound, given it depth and truth. She decided to accept, not because she needed validation, but because she wanted to continue growing. She understood that learning did not erase authenticity, it could support it. She returned to her piano and played once more, not out of habit, but out of gratitude. The notes filled the room, carrying a sense of forward movement. As Clara prepared for the next chapter, she remained grounded in who she was. The simple woman they once mocked had never been simple in spirit. She had carried music through silence, grief, and doubt. And now it carried her forward not as a surprise, but as a natural continuation of her journey. Clara began her new routine quietly without announcing it to the world. She still woke early and walked to the grocery store for her shifts, but her days now carried an added layer of purpose. Knowing that music was no longer something hidden only for late nights gave her a steady strength. She felt no rush to leave her job immediately, because it had supported her through years of uncertainty, and she respected that part of her life. The mentorship offered by the judges began modestly with weekly sessions in a small practice room at the cultural center. The mentor was an older pianist named Alina who carried herself with calm confidence. She did not speak much at first. Instead, she listened. She asked Clara to play pieces she loved, pieces she struggled with, and pieces she had written fragments of but never finished. Alina paid close attention not just to technique, but to how Clara breathed, how she held tension, and where emotion her sound. Their sessions were not formal lessons in the traditional sense. Alina rarely corrected mistakes directly. She asked questions instead, asking why Clara chose certain phrasing, or why she hesitated before particular passages. These questions forced Clara to look inward rather than outward. She realized how often she had played defensively, afraid of being wrong rather than freely expressing intentions. Slowly, that fear began to loosen. Outside of lessons, Clara practiced daily with new awareness. She noticed habits she had developed from years of playing alone. Some were strengths, others limitations. Alina encouraged her to keep what felt true and examine what no longer served her. This approach made learning feel collaborative rather than corrective. It allowed Clara to trust herself while growing. As weeks passed, word of her audition performance spread quietly through the local music community. A small group of students attended open rehearsals at the center and began to recognize her. Some approached her shyly, asking questions about her journey. Clara answered honestly, sharing that she had learned slowly, imperfectly, and often alone. She did not position herself as a success story, but as someone still learning. That honesty drew people to her. At the grocery store, changes were subtle but noticeable. A coworker mentioned seeing her name on a notice board at the cultural center. Another asked if she was really the woman people were talking about. Clara smiled politely and changed the subject. She did not enjoy attention, but she no longer shrank from acknowledgement. She allowed it to exist without defining her. Alina eventually suggested that Clara perform in a small, informal recital, nothing grand, just a room with a piano and a few listeners. Clara hesitated at first. The audition had been different, she told herself. It was a test, not an invitation, but Alina reminded her that sharing music was not about proving anything, it was about connection. Clara agreed reluctantly, trusting the guidance she had come to value. The recital took place on a quiet evening with fewer than 30 people in attendance. The room was softly lit and intimate. Clara wore the same simple dress she had worn to the audition. She sat at the piano, feeling the familiar calm return. As she began to play, she sensed the audience leaning in, not with expectation, but with openness. That difference mattered. Her performance flowed naturally. Each piece felt like a conversation rather than a declaration. She allowed imperfections to exist without panic, trusting the emotional arc more than technical precision. When she finished, there was gentle applause and a sense of shared experience. Clara felt fulfilled in a way she had never known before. It was not the applause itself, but the feeling of having communicated something real. After the recital, several people approached her expressing gratitude. One said her playing reminded them of someone they had lost. Another said it made them want to return to music after years away. Clara listened quietly, absorbing their words with humility. She realized then that music was not only her refuge but a bridge between lives. As months passed, Clara began to reduce her hours at the store, balancing work with study and performance. She adjusted carefully, unwilling to abandon stability too quickly. Alina supported this balance, reminding her that progress did not require sudden change. Clara appreciated this patience. It mirrored her own approach to growth. Her relationship with music deepened beyond performance. She began journaling about pieces she played, reflecting on what emotions surfaced and why. She revisited childhood memories tied to sound, especially moments with her mother. She allowed grief to exist alongside gratitude, understanding now that both shaped her voice. One evening after a long practice session, Clara sat quietly at the piano and realized she no longer played to escape her life. She played to inhabit it fully. The instrument was no longer a shield, but an extension of who she was. That realization settled gently, bringing peace rather than excitement. The mockery from the first audition felt distant now, not erased, but transformed. It no longer held power over her identity. Instead, it served as a reminder of how easily people misunderstand what they cannot see. Clara carried that lesson with compassion. She judged others less quickly and listened more deeply in all areas of her life. Alina eventually spoke to her about future possibilities, larger performances, teaching opportunities, and collaborations. Clara listened with openness, but without urgency. She had learned that fulfillment was not found in rushing forward, But in moving with intention, whatever path she chose would be built on the foundation she had reclaimed: her voice, her patience, and her truth. As Clara walked home one evening after practice, she passed the cultural center where her journey had shifted. She paused briefly, looking at the windows glowing softly against the night. She felt gratitude not just for the opportunity, but for the years of quiet persistence that made it meaningful. She continued walking, carrying music within her, steady and alive, ready for whatever came next. As Clara moved deeper into her new life, the changes around her became more visible. Though she still carried herself with the same quiet manner, she now spent most mornings practicing at the cultural center, where the rooms echoed with scales, fragments of melodies, and distant voices. She learned to share space with other musicians, something that once intimidated her, but now felt grounding. Being surrounded by sound reminded her that music was a living, shared language, not a solitary refuge. Alina continued guiding her with patience, but also with growing expectation. She encouraged Clara to study theory and history not as rigid systems, but as stories of human expression. Clara approached these studies with curiosity rather than pressure. She discovered composers who had struggled, lived quietly, or been overlooked in their time. Their journeys resonated deeply and helped her understand that recognition and worth often move on different timelines. One afternoon, Alina invited Clara to sit in on a class she taught for young students. Clara agreed, feeling unsure of her place among them. She listened as Alina spoke about listening rather than performing, about understanding silence and intention. The students asked questions with innocence and honesty. Clara recognized herself in their curiosity. After the session, one student approached her and asked how she learned to play with so much feeling. Clara answered simply that she lived a lot before she played a lot. The child nodded as if that made perfect sense. Teaching was not something Clara had considered, but the experience stayed with her. She realized that sharing knowledge did not require authority, only sincerity. Over time, she began assisting Alina, offering gentle guidance during practice sessions. She spoke softly, encouraging students to trust their instincts and listen inwardly. Her presence brought calm, and students responded to her naturally without fear. Outside the center, Clara began performing more frequently in small venues, libraries, community halls, and local gatherings. Each performance was different, shaped by the space and audience. She learned to adjust not by changing who she was, but by listening carefully to the room. Music became a conversation rather than a presentation. She felt deeply connected during these moments, grounded and open. Her relationship with her past also evolved. She visited her childhood neighborhood for the first time in years. Walking slowly past familiar streets, she stood outside the building where her mother once lived and remembered the sound of laughter and piano lessons drifting through thin walls. She did not feel sorrow as she once did. Instead, she felt gratitude for the beginning she had been given, even though it was brief. At the grocery store, Clara eventually gave notice. Her manager thanked her sincerely and told her she would always have a place there. The farewell was simple but meaningful. Coworkers expressed pride and surprise. Clara accepted their words with humility. She understood that leaving did not mean forgetting, it meant carrying that chapter forward as part of who she was. With more time available, Clara dedicated herself fully to music, but kept her life balanced. She cooked simple meals, took long walks, and maintained quiet routines. She did not chase attention or opportunity aggressively. Instead, she allowed invitations to come naturally, trusting her path. She had learned that growth did not require constant noise. One evening, she received a message from a regional arts organization, inviting her to perform as part of a featured program highlighting unconventional musical journeys. The invitation described her as someone who reminded audiences of the human heart behind the instrument. Clara read the message several times, feeling a mix of surprise and calm. She accepted after a thoughtful pause. Preparing for the program brought new challenges. The venue was larger, the audience unfamiliar. Alina supported her, but allowed Clara to lead her own preparation. Clara chose pieces that reflected her journey, music shaped by patience, loss, resilience, and quiet joy. She practiced steadily, focusing on clarity and connection rather than perfection. The night of the performance, Clara stepped onto the stage with a sense of grounded presence. The lights were bright but not overwhelming. The audience waited attentively. She sat at the piano, took a breath, and began. The music filled the space, carrying warmth and sincerity. She felt connected not only to the listeners, but to herself. Every note felt intentional, rooted in experience. When she finished, the applause was generous, but not explosive. It felt respectful and genuine. Clara stood, acknowledged the audience, and left the stage feeling fulfilled. The success of the evening was not measured by volume or acclaim, but by the sense of truth she carried. Off stage afterwards, several people approached her, sharing stories of how her music had affected them. Clara listened, carefully recognizing the same pattern she had seen before: music opening doors within others. She realized that her role was not to impress, but to invite reflection. That understanding settled deeply within her. As Clara continued forward, she no longer thought of herself as ordinary or exceptional. She simply thought of herself as a musician who had listened long enough to speak honestly. Her journey had not erased doubt or difficulty, but it had given her clarity. She moved through her days with quiet confidence, carrying music as both guide and companion, ready to continue wherever the path led. As Clara settled further into her life as a musician, she began to understand that growth did not always arrive with excitement. Sometimes it came quietly through consistency and reflection. Her days developed a steady rhythm: morning practice, afternoon teaching, evening walks, and occasional performances. She no longer measured progress by external milestones. Instead, she paid attention to how present she felt while playing and how honestly she listened to herself and others. Her teaching role slowly expanded. Alina trusted her more each week, allowing her to guide students independently. Clara approached each session with care, remembering how intimidating music once felt. When surrounded by judgment, she focused on building confidence before technique, encouraging students to explore sound without fear. She reminded them that mistakes were part of learning, not signs of failure. This philosophy resonated especially with older students who had returned to music after years of absence. One student in particular stood out, a middle-aged man who had abandoned piano decades earlier. Because of harsh criticism, he played timidly, his hands stiff and uncertain. Clara recognized that fear. She guided him gently, helping him reconnect with the joy of sound rather than correctness. Over time, his posture softened and his playing gained warmth. Watching his transformation reminded Clara of her own journey and reinforced why she chose this path. Beyond teaching and performing, Clara also began composing quietly. At first, she did not aim to create grand works. Instead, she wrote short pieces inspired by daily moments, a conversation, a walk, a memory. These compositions felt deeply personal, like journal entries in sound. Alina encouraged her to explore this side of herself, suggesting that her voice extended beyond interpretation into creation. Clara hesitated, but continued, trusting the process. As her compositions grew, she shared a few during small gatherings. The response was intimate and sincere. Listeners described feeling seen and comforted. Clara realized that originality did not require complexity. It required honesty. Her music reflected a life lived attentively, and that was enough. Despite her progress, moments of doubt still surfaced occasionally. She questioned whether she truly belonged in professional spaces, especially when surrounded by highly trained musicians. Yet these thoughts passed more quickly now. She had learned to ground herself in purpose rather than comparison. When doubt arose, she returned to the piano and listened. The sound always brought clarity. One afternoon, Clara was invited to speak at a small community event about non-traditional artistic paths. Standing before the audience, she felt the familiar nervousness return, but she welcomed it. She spoke simply about patience, persistence, and listening. Inwardly, she did not frame her story as a triumph, but as a continuation. Her honesty resonated deeply, especially with those who felt they had started too late or been overlooked. After the talk, several people approached her. One woman shared that she had hidden her love for painting for years because of fear. Another said he had stopped writing after being told it was impractical. Clara listened, knowing that her role was not to advise, but to affirm possibility. These interactions reinforced her belief that vulnerability carried power. As time passed, Clara began to receive invitations beyond her local community. She traveled, occasionally performing in neighboring towns. Each journey expanded her perspective, exposing her to different audiences and stories. She remained grounded, returning home between trips, valuing the familiarity of her routine. Travel did not excite her as much as connection, and she chose opportunities carefully. During one visit, she reunited with a former audition contestant who had once laughed quietly at her appearance. The encounter was awkward at first. The person apologized, sincerely acknowledging their mistake. Clara accepted the apology without resentment. She understood now that judgment often masked insecurity. The moment felt like closure, not just for that person, but for her own lingering memory of the audition. In private moments, Clara reflected on how far she had come. She remembered the woman who once played only at night, afraid of disturbing others. That woman still lived within her, not as weakness, but as origin. She honored that part of herself, knowing it shaped her sensitivity and depth. Growth had not erased her past, it had integrated it. Music no longer served as escape or proof, it was simply expression. Clara played when she felt full, and when she felt empty. Trusting both states, she allowed silence into her life without fear, knowing that sound would return when needed. This balance brought a sense of peace she had never known. As she looked ahead, Clara did not envision fame or legacy. She envisioned continued honesty, continued learning, and continued sharing. She understood that success for her meant remaining true to her voice. Recognition. The world had finally listened, but more importantly, she had learned to listen to herself. Her journey from mockery to respect was not a dramatic transformation, but a gradual unfolding. It was built on patience, humility, and courage. Clara moved forward with quiet confidence, ready to continue playing, not to be seen, but to connect. And in that connection, she found lasting fulfillment. As Clara continued along her path, she noticed a subtle but meaningful change in how she experienced the world. She listened more deeply, not only to music, but to people, to spaces, to silence. Conversations felt richer because she no longer rushed to respond. She had learned through music that meaning often lived between moments, and she carried that awareness everywhere. Her reputation within the community grew steadily, though quietly. She was no longer introduced as the woman from the audition, but simply as Clara the pianist. This shift mattered to her because it meant she was no longer defined by a single moment, but by consistency and presence. She valued that deeply because it reflected the way she had lived her life, patiently, without spectacle. One season, she was invited to collaborate with a small ensemble made up of musicians from different backgrounds. Some were classically trained, others self-taught like her. The group met weekly to explore music without rigid structure. They shared ideas, experimented freely, and listened openly. Clara felt at ease in this environment because it mirrored her own. Music was not something to control, but something to understand. Together during rehearsals, she noticed how her confidence had matured. She spoke when needed and remained silent when listening served better. Her suggestions were thoughtful, grounded in emotion rather than ego. The group respected her not because she demanded attention, But because her presence brought clarity over time, the ensemble developed a sound that felt organic and sincere. Their first public performance, as a group, took place in a modest outdoor venue with families and passersby gathered casually. The setting was informal, children played nearby, and the air carried the scent of food and laughter. Clara loved this atmosphere because it reminded her that music belonged everywhere, not just in quiet halls. The performance unfolded naturally, and the audience responded with warmth and genuine appreciation. After the event, a woman approached Clara with tears in her eyes. She shared that she had lost someone dear, and that the music helped her feel close. Again, Clara listened and offered a gentle embrace. In moments like these, Clara understood the true purpose of her journey. Music had given her a way to meet others in their most honest places. As the years moved forward, Clara began to feel a desire to document her experiences, not for recognition, but for reflection. She started writing quietly each morning before practice, recording thoughts, memories, and lessons learned through writing. She discovered new layers of understanding. She realized how much fear she once carried, and how gradually it had softened through trust and persistence. These reflections helped her articulate what music meant to her beyond sound. It was patience learned through repetition, humility learned through listening, and courage learned through vulnerability. Clara shared some of these writings with Alina, who encouraged her to continue. She suggested that Clara consider sharing them publicly someday. Clara smiled, unsure, but appreciative. Meanwhile, her teaching continued to evolve. She welcomed students of all ages and backgrounds, creating a space where no one felt late or inadequate. She emphasized listening before playing and feeling before correcting. Her students progressed not only in skill, but in confidence. Parents noticed changes in posture, expression, and joy. Clara understood that teaching was not about shaping musicians, but about supporting people through sound. One afternoon, a former student returned after years away. They thanked Clara for creating a safe beginning that allowed them to reconnect with music later in life. The gratitude moved her deeply. It reminded her that impact often appeared long after effort had passed. She carried this awareness quietly, letting it guide her without expectation. Though life felt full, Clara still experienced moments of solitude. She welcomed them now rather than fearing them. Silence had become a companion rather than an enemy. During these moments, she reflected on her mother and the early lessons that shaped her. She felt a quiet conversation through memory and sound. She no longer wished for different circumstances. She honored what had been. At times, she returned to the cultural center late at night when the rooms were empty. She sat at the piano and played freely without structure, letting her hands wander. These sessions felt like conversations with herself, unfiltered and honest. They grounded her, reminding her that everything she shared with others began here in quiet truth. When people asked Clara how she found the courage to continue after being mocked, she answered simply that she did not focus on courage. She focused on listening to herself, listening to the music, and listening to the moments that asked her to move forward. Courage followed naturally as a result of attention. As she looked toward the future, Clara felt no urgency to define it. She trusted that opportunities would arrive when aligned with her values. She had learned to recognize when something felt forced, and when it felt right. This discernment brought peace. She no longer feared missing out because she knew her path was her own. The woman who once sat alone in an audition hall, judged by appearance, had grown into someone deeply rooted and quietly influential. Her journey was not about proving others wrong, but about honoring herself through patience, honesty, and connection. She had transformed not just her life, but the lives she touched along the way. And as she continued forward, she carried music not as armor or ambition, but as truth, shared gently and freely wherever she went. As time continued to move forward, Clara reached a place of quiet understanding about her life and her journey. She no longer thought of the audition as a turning point, defined by judgment or surprise. Instead, she saw it as a moment that revealed what had always been within her: patience, honesty, and resilience. The mockery she once faced had faded into the background, not forgotten, but transformed into perspective. It reminded her how easily people misunderstand what they cannot immediately recognize. Clara now lived with a deep sense of balance. Her days were full, but not rushed. Her mornings often began in silence before sound. She would sit by the window with a cup of warm tea, watching light change across the city. She found beauty in small details: shadows, movement, breath. These moments grounded her. Before she touched the piano, they reminded her that music was an extension of life, not something separate. When she played now, her sound carried a calm confidence. It was not louder or more dramatic, but it was clear. Listeners often described feeling safe when hearing her play. Clara understood this feeling because safety was what she had searched for most of her life. Through music, she had finally found it within herself and shared it naturally with others. Her connection with Alina remained strong, though their relationship had evolved. They spoke less about technique and more about meaning, about when to speak and when to remain still. Alina once told her that teaching Clara had taught her as much as guiding. Clara smiled, knowing that learning flowed in both directions. Their bond was built on respect, not hierarchy. Clara also continued to write quietly, her pages filled with reflections, stories, and moments of insight. She did not write to impress or instruct, she wrote to understand. One evening, she realized that these writings told the same story as her music. They spoke of endurance, kindness, and listening. She began to see her life not as fragmented chapters, but as a single continuous movement. Eventually, a small publisher approached her. Hearing one of her talks, they suggested compiling her reflections and musical thoughts into a modest book. Clara hesitated, not because of fear, but because she valued privacy. After thoughtful consideration, she agreed on the condition that the book remained simple and honest, without embellishment. The process of shaping her words felt similar to composing music, requiring clarity, restraint, and truth. When the book was released, It reached people quietly just as her music had readers wrote letters sharing how. Her words helped them reconnect with creativity after loss or doubt. Clara read each letter carefully, responding. When she could, she did not feel responsible for changing lives, but she felt honored to witness connection. She understood now that influence did not need volume to be real. Years passed gently. Clara aged with grace, carrying her experiences lightly. She continued performing, teaching, and composing, but always returned to the same core intention: to listen deeply. She never forgot the woman she once was. Sitting alone in a corner of an audition hall, feeling unseen, that memory kept her humble and compassionate. It reminded her to notice those who stood quietly waiting on rare occasions. She was invited to speak about that audition moment. People often expected drama or triumph. She told the story, simply describing how she played honestly and how others responded. She emphasized not the mockery, but the listening that followed. She wanted people to understand that transformation happened when attention replaced assumption. In her private moments, Clara still played alone late at night. The apartment was quieter now, the city outside slower. Her fingers moved with ease, shaped by decades of trust. She no longer practiced to improve. She played to reflect. Each note carried gratitude for the path she walked and the people she met along the way. Clara understood that her life would not be remembered for fame or spectacle. It would be remembered through moments of connection, through students who found courage, through listeners felt understood, through quiet rooms filled with honest sound. That was enough. She had never wanted more than that. As she looked back, she saw that being mocked had never truly been the story. The story was about persistence. The story was about listening when others spoke and playing when others doubted. The story was about a woman who carried music patiently until the world was ready to hear it. In the end, Clara lived not as someone who proved others wrong, but as someone who proved herself true. She remained simple in the way she moved through the world, but her simplicity held depth, shaped by experience, love, and resilience. Her music continued long after words ended, carried forward in those who listened and felt something awaken within themselves. And so her journey closed not with applause or recognition, but with quiet fulfillment. Clara sat at her piano one evening as the light faded and played softly. The sound filled the room, gently, complete, and honest, just as it always had. Always had.